It was smaller than a coin, a single fragment from the tip of a child's little finger lifted out of the cold floor of a cave in southern Siberia in the summer of 2008. Nobody who handled it understood what it was. It looked like one more scrap in a place already full of scraps, the kind of thing that gets a catalogue number and a drawer. But sealed inside that splinter of bone was the genome of an entire kind of human being that no one had ever named, no one had ever drawn, and no one had ever known had walked the earth. And here is the part that should not be possible. Some of the people listening to this right now are carrying that vanished human's DNA inside their own bodies. For most of human history, nobody knew it was there. For most of the history of science, nobody knew it was there either. That is the contradiction at the center of this case. A whole branch of humanity left almost no trace. It raised no monument we can stand inside. It disappeared so completely that for nearly the entire 20th century, the accepted story of Ice Age Eurasia held only two kinds of human being. There was us, anatomically modern people, and there were the Neanderthals. Two species sharing a continent, a clean, teachable, finished picture. The trouble is that the clean picture was wrong, and the evidence that broke it was so small it was almost overlooked entirely. To understand why this matters, you have to understand what was actually at stake. The question underneath all of this is the oldest question our species asks about itself. Where did we come from? And who else was here when we arrived? For decades, the answer felt settled. Modern humans left Africa, spread across the world, met the Neanderthals in Europe and the Near East, and eventually stood alone. The family tree had a trunk and one extinct cousin, and the rest was detail. What that pinky bone forced open was not a detail. It was the realization that the human family during the Ice Age was crowded, that we were not the only intelligent, tool-using, child-rearing people on the planet, and that the others did not simply die out and vanish. They left something behind. They left it in us. But in 2008, none of that was visible. The finger bone was recovered during excavations led by the Russian scientists Anatoly Derevianko and Michael Shunkov of the Russian Academy of Sciences, who had been working the layers of Denisova Cave for years. The cave was already known to be extraordinary. Its sediments record human presence stretching back hundreds of thousands of years. So, a small bone fragment was not by itself a headline. It was sent to a laboratory in Leipzig, Germany, almost as a routine matter, to a team that specialized in pulling ancient DNA out of material that everyone else had given up on. What happened next is one of the few moments in modern science that has the texture of a thriller. At the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology, a young researcher named Johannes Krause set out to read the mitochondrial DNA inside the bone, the small loop of genetic code passed down only from mother to child. He expected one of two answers. Either this was a modern human or it was a Neanderthal, because those were the only people supposed to be in that place at that time. Instead, the sequence came back as something else. Something that matched neither. Something that sat far outside both branches of the family. Krause has described phoning his colleague Svante Pääbo and telling him he should sit down before he heard the result. The mitochondrial DNA in that finger bone was roughly twice as distant from us as the Neanderthals were. It pointed to a lineage that had split away from the line leading to us and the Neanderthals around 1 million years ago. Sit with that for a moment, because it raises a question the team could not yet answer. If this was a previously unknown kind of human, widespread enough to leave a body in a Siberian cave, then where were all the others? Where were the skeletons, the skulls, the long record a whole population should leave across a continent over hundreds of thousands of years? One finger bone was being asked to carry the weight of an entire branch of humanity, and in March 2010, When Krauss, Pabo, and their colleagues published the mitochondrial result in the journal Nature, they were careful. They did not announce a new species outright. They described an unknown hominin. In the press, the individual was nicknamed the X-woman because the analysis suggested the bone had belonged to a female and because no one knew what else to call her. Later that same year, the team went further, and this is where the story stops being a curiosity and becomes a problem for the old timeline. Using techniques that required only milligrams of material, the Leipzig group, working with the geneticist David Reich at Harvard and an international team, sequenced not just the mitochondrial loop, but the nuclear genome, the full genetic blueprint. The draft was published in Nature in December 2010. They gave the population a name drawn from the cave itself, Denisovans, and the genome carried a detail that no one had predicted. When the researchers compared it to people living today, they found that present-day populations in Melanesia, in places like New Guinea and the islands of the southwestern Pacific, carried something between 4 and 6% Denisovan DNA in their genomes. Stop and feel the strangeness of that. A finger bone from a freezing cave in Siberia was genetically linked to people living thousands of kilometers away in tropical islands under a completely different sky. The only way that connection could exist is if Denisovans and the ancestors of modern humans had met and had children, and if those children had descendants who survived all the way to the present. The vanished people were not entirely gone. They had been absorbed. And that forces the uncomfortable question that powers the rest of this investigation. If the evidence of this lost humanity was hiding inside living people the entire time, why did it take until 2010 for anyone to see it? Why did the story stay small for so long? Part of the answer is simply that you cannot find what you do not have the tools to read. The Denisovans were, for most of the 20th century, invisible by definition. Their bones, when they existed at all, did not look obviously different enough to demand a new category, or they were too fragmentary to classify, or they were filed away under names that already existed. The science of reading ancient DNA, the science that finally exposed them, did not mature until the 21st century. So the evidence was not absent, it was unreadable. And unreadable evidence is the easiest kind to misunderstand because silence looks exactly like proof that nothing is there. This is the heart of what makes the Denisovan case different from a simple discovery. It is not a story about people who hid the truth. It is a story about how a true thing can sit in plain sight, in a museum drawer or a monastery or a fishing net, for years or even decades, classified as something smaller than it is, simply because the world did not yet have the means to ask the right question. To see how that works, you have to follow the bones that were already found long before 2010 and trace what happened to them. Until now, this looks like an accident of timing, a discovery that came late because the technology came late. A gap in knowledge, nothing more. But then the record changes, because some of these fossils were not lost in the ground waiting to be dug up. They had already been found. They had already been held in human hands. And what happened to them after they were found was shaped by very specific people making very specific choices under pressures that had nothing to do with biology. Consider a fossil that had been sitting on the Tibetan plateau side of this story for nearly 4 decades. In 1980, a Buddhist monk found the right half of a heavy ancient jawbone in Baixia Karst Cave, high on the edge of the Tibetan plateau in Gansu, China. He did not send it to a laboratory. He gave it, by the account that survives, to a local religious authority, the 6th Gongthang living Buddha, and from there it eventually passed to Lanzhou University. For years, it was simply a robust, primitive-looking jaw with large teeth, intriguing but unplaceable. It had no readable DNA. By the older rules of the science, an unreadable jaw was a dead end. Now widen the lens, because there is a second fossil with an even stranger history. Off the coast of Taiwan, in the Penghu Channel, fishermen working the seafloor had dragged up a thick, powerful lower jaw, along with the bones of extinct animals, the remains of a drowned Ice Age landscape now under the sea. The jaw, known as Penghu 1, was unmistakably ancient and unmistakably odd. It was sturdier than a modern human jaw, with the kind of heavy build that did not fit easily into any known category for that region. For years, scientists argued about what it was. Some thought it might represent a late archaic population. Some were not sure it could be classified at all. The fossil existed, it was studied, it simply could not be made to speak. And then there is the most dramatic case of all, a skull that spent most of a century deliberately hidden. In 1933, near Harbin in northeastern China, during a period of Japanese military occupation, a laborer is said to have found a remarkably complete human skull. Rather than surrender it, he reportedly hid it down a well, where it stayed for around 85 years. It surfaced only when the man revealed its location near the end of his life, and the skull was finally donated to science. It was enormous and strange, with a huge brain case, a long, low vault, and massive brow ridges. In 2021, a team of Chinese researchers led by Shi Junni studied it and proposed that it represented an entirely new human species. They named it Homo longi, Dragon Man, after the Dragon River region where it had been found. Look closely at that moment, because it is the cleanest example in this entire case of how the story gets shaped by human hands rather than simply discovered. These were serious scientists doing careful work. The skull genuinely did not match any confirmed species at the time. Naming it Homo longi was a defensible scientific judgment, but it also did something subtle. By giving the Harbin skull its own brand new species name, the classification placed it on a separate branch, set apart from the Denisovan story that was unfolding at the same time. The Denisovans were known mainly from DNA and tiny bones with no face. The Harbin skull was a magnificent face with, at first, no DNA. And so, two halves of what might be the same picture were filed under different names, in different conversations, by different teams, not out of malice. Out of the ordinary friction of science, where categories are drawn before all the evidence is in, where national research traditions and academic rivalries shape which name gets attached to which bone, and where a fossil with no readable genetic code can only be sorted by the shape of its surfaces. So now there were jaws and a skull and teeth scattered across Asia, in monasteries and museum storage and the holds of fishing boats, any one of which might belong to the same vanished people whose finger bone had rewritten the textbook in Siberia. And the question that should make the hair on your neck stand up is this: what if the only thing separating these objects from the Denisovan story was that no one could yet read them? What if the proof had been collected, catalogued, argued over, and set aside again and again, simply waiting for a method that did not exist yet? That method was already coming, and it would not depend on DNA at all. To understand the breakthrough, you have to understand a limitation. Ancient DNA is fragile. In cold, dry, stable places like a Siberian cave, it can survive for tens of thousands of years. But in warm, humid places, the kind of places much of Asia actually is, genetic material breaks down fast. That is one reason the Denisovans seemed to be a creature of the cold north. The only places their DNA survived well enough to read were cold. The warm parts of their range, the very places where their descendants in Melanesia suggested they must have lived, were genetic dead zones. So even after 2010, The bones from China and Taiwan stayed locked out of the story, not because they were silent, but because the language everyone was using to read fossils, the language of DNA, could not be recovered from them. The way through was a different molecule: proteins. Proteins are built from the instructions in our genes, and crucially, proteins survive far longer than DNA in far harsher conditions. The sequences of amino acids that make up an ancient protein still carry a faint signature of the genetic code that produced them. And so, a new discipline matured: the reading of ancient proteins, paleoproteomics, capable of pulling identity out of fossils that had no DNA left at all. The researcher Frido Welker, working with the Max Planck team and with the Lanzhou University scientists Fahu Chen and Dongju Zhang, turned this method on that long-ignored jaw from the Tibetan plateau. In 2019, the result was published in Nature, and it changed the shape of the map. The Tibetan jaw, the Siahe mandible, contained ancient proteins whose signature marked it as Denisovan. It was the first confirmed Denisovan fossil ever found outside Denisova Cave, and it was old. Uranium series dating of the carbonate crust on the bone, carried out by Chuan Cho Shen of National Taiwan University, put it at least 160,000 years into the past. The implications landed hard. Denisovans had not been a small, cold-adapted curiosity huddled in one Siberian cave. They had lived high on the Tibetan plateau, in thin, low-oxygen air, more than 100,000 years before modern humans ever reached that altitude. And this connected to something that had been quietly proven 5 years earlier in the bodies of living people. In 2014, the geneticists Emilia Huerta Sanchez and Rasmus Nielsen and their colleagues had published a study in Nature on a gene called EPAS1. It is sometimes described as the gene that lets Tibetans live where the air is thin, regulating how the body handles low oxygen without thickening the blood to a dangerous degree. When the team examined the particular version of EPAS1 that gives Tibetans their advantage, they found something extraordinary. That specific variant was not found in other populations around the world. It matched the Denisovan genome. The people of the high plateau were thriving at altitude, using a piece of genetic code inherited from the vanished people who had lived there first. The Denisovans were not just a fossil. They were a living adaptation, still working, still keeping human beings alive on the roof of the world. Now the pieces were converging from every direction at once. A genome from a finger bone, a 4 to 6% inheritance in Melanesia, a high-altitude gene in Tibet, a jaw on the plateau, read through proteins older than anyone expected. The old explanation, that Eurasia in the Ice Age was a simple world of moderns and Neanderthals, was no longer just incomplete. It was visibly, structurally too small to hold the evidence. All that was missing was a face, and the final proof that the bones in the museum drawers and the fishing nets belonged to this same lost humanity. In 2025, both arrived. First, the jaw from the sea. A team applying ancient protein analysis to Penghu-1, the heavy mandible dredged from the channel off Taiwan, reported their findings in the journal Science. They recovered thousands of amino acid residues and identified Denisovan-specific variants in the protein sequences. Markers in the proteins even confirmed that the individual had been male. The jaw that no one could classify for years was a Denisovan, and its location mattered as much as its identity because Taiwan is warm and humid, the exact kind of place where the old DNA-based science had been blind. The Denisovan range now stretched from the freezing Altai to the subtropical edge of the Pacific. Then the skull. The same year, in the journal Cell, the paleogeneticist Qiaomei Fu, who years earlier had worked on the original Denisova material, reported that she and her team had extracted genetic and protein evidence from the Harbin skull, the dragon man, partly from the hardened dental plaque on its single surviving tooth. The mitochondrial signature and the protein variants pointed to one conclusion. The magnificent century-hidden skull from the well in Harbin was a Denisovan. The people who for 15 years had existed mostly as a sequence of letters in a database, a ghost reconstructed from a fingertip, suddenly had a face. A broad face, with a huge brain case and heavy brows, looking back across at least 140,000 years. And now hold all of it together, because this is the moment the old story can no longer stand comfortably. The same lost people are present in a Siberian fingerbone, in a hybrid child of a Neanderthal mother and a Denisovan father also found in that cave, in a jaw on the Tibetan plateau, in a jaw beneath the sea off Taiwan, in a skull hidden in a Chinese well, in a high-altitude gene beating in the blood of living Tibetans, and in 4 to 6% of the genomes of people across Melanesia. A species that science nearly missed entirely, that almost lived and died as a single unclassifiable fragment, turns out to have spanned a continent, crossed climates, and woven itself permanently into us. It is right that some of this remains debated. A number of researchers have urged caution about how much weight a handful of protein variants can carry, and the precise naming, Denisovan or Homo longi, is still argued in the literature. But notice what is no longer in doubt. The existence of these people is not the uncertain part anymore. The only argument left is over what to call them and exactly how to draw the branches. The vanished humanity is real. The evidence simply waited until we were ready to read it. Which brings us back to that splinter of finger bone, smaller than a coin, that almost no one looked at twice. For most of the 20th century, the family tree of humanity had a trunk and a single extinct cousin, and the story felt complete. We now know that the Ice Age world was crowded with other kinds of people, that at least one of those kinds met our ancestors and had children with them, and that their inheritance is still alive in human bodies on islands and mountaintops today. The old story was not a lie. It was simply too small, written by people who were missing a chapter they had no way to read. The Denisovans did not change the story of humanity by destroying it. They corrected it and made it larger, and reminded us that we were never as alone in our own past as we believed. Once you see the evidence, the old story never looks the same again. Subscribe to History Rewritten, because the past is not gone. It is waiting to be re-examined.